get started for the day. Hello, everyone. So let's just begin. I actually have some good news for a change. We are being told to plan as if the fall semester is going to progress as normal, as if we'll be meeting in campus, face-to-face sessions. There probably will be some weird restrictions. The classes maybe are going to be a little bit smaller than usual, so there could be some more social distancing. But yeah, the current plan at least is for fall to sort of proceed as normal on CSU. So that's great. I don't know about you all, but yeah, I would much rather be doing this face to face than be doing this online. I hope we're doing the online stuff as well as we can at least. But yeah, so it looks like so I'm sorry to those of you who are graduating, you won't take advantage of it. But for those who are planning on returning in the fall, at least the current plan anyway is that we're going to return to fall as normal. They are telling us to sort of have a contingency plan in case things get really bad again. So there's still the possibility of things changing, but at least right now, and this is new, they hadn't told us this for a couple days ago. So as of right now, at least the current plan is to sort of open up and fall as normal. So that's good news. Yeah, so that's good news. I don't have anything more to say about that, actually. That's just good news. We're also, so let's just talk about a little bit. So we're sort of wrapping up the course a little bit. So today we're going to sort of finish up with our sort of playing with this question of whether or not how life and intelligence are related to one another. Could there be a intelligent thing like data that's also not alive, or doesn't the presence of intelligence sort of demonstrate and prove the presence of life? So we've been playing with that question. We're going to continue to play with it a little bit today. My plan for next Tuesday is to have it be a big, just sort of course overview day. You know, we'll go over sort of what we've been doing from the beginning, take it all the way to sort of what we've been doing here, maybe talk about the papers a little bit more if people have questions. But my plan is for Tuesday to pretty much be a wrap-up day. And unless people still have a lot more questions that we don't get to on Tuesday, my plan is just not to have class on Thursday. So give everyone the day off. Next Thursday, to be clear, not today, next Thursday, to be clear. So that's my plan. There aren't going to be any more daily assignments or anything. There aren't going to be any new readings for there to be daily assignments on going forward. So pretty much all that's left is the paper for people who still need to do papers and the presentations for people who still need to do presentations. I did get another sort of video presentation that I've uploaded to YouTube. So, you know, go watch it, go see some Doctor Who and moral personhood questions discussed in presentation format. So yeah, go watch that. It was a very interesting presentation. And again, you know, what else do you have to do with your time? Come on, you're all stuck at home anyway. I'm kidding. I know you're not all stuck, but yeah, if you've got the time anyway, go watch it. Go see an interesting, good 10-minute presentation. And if we get any more of those, I'll continue to post those to the YouTube page as the semester sort of moves along. So I think that's all the sort of initial business stuff I have. I have a couple of drafts. I've responded to a few of them. I have a couple other sort of paper drafts to sort of get to. I'll try to get to those probably over the weekend, probably give people some more comments there. Other than that, yeah, does anyone have any questions or comments for me? All right, then let's just keep playing. It's probably, I don't know how long we're going to go today. I figured if we began the semester with Aristotle, why not end with Aristotle too? Just, you know, go full circle with it. Today we're going to actually give at least an answer, not necessarily the answer, but at least an answer to the question that many of you have been pushing me on again and again and again. If data is intelligent, doesn't he have to be alive? Okay. And Aristotle agrees with you. Aristotle concurs. And so we're going to really just try to go through Aristotle's argument today. That's basically what we're going to try to do, to try to sort of show why Aristotle thinks that anything that is intelligent must also be a life form. And yeah, so last little bit of play with some of these ideas, and also some things that might help with your paper too. The way Aristotle's going to talk about capacities maybe are things you'll find helpful for your own writings too about life. So yeah, if no one has anything else, let's just get started with it. Anything else? All right, then let's just get started with things. So let's turn really fast. We've been talking about this question: how is life related to intelligence? This has been sort of the question we've been playing with for the last little bit. And what we're fundamentally interested in, there's a couple different ways you can ask this question. Can something be intelligent but not alive? And I'm sort of just, intelligence is the word that I keep using, but intelligence or rational or conscious, I mean, these words aren't all synonyms, but they're all at least related sort of concepts, at least. So, if these ideas are sort of in some sense or another related to one another, is it possible for something to have these properties but not be life forms? And in that unit we were doing, that big long unit we were doing just about trying to come up with an account of life, no one we read sort of really gave us an answer to this question. All of them were really just concerned with the question of life. And how life relates to things like consciousness or intelligence, they sort of just pushed off to the side. They recognized in a lot of cases that there is a relationship between that question and the question of what life is in general. But they weren't interested in answering that specific question. You saw this in a couple different ways, like Bowden at the end of her piece, for example. She just sort of says, like, a lot of philosophers have claimed that only living things can be intelligent. So therefore, if a cloud can't be alive, a cloud's not intelligent. But she doesn't really argue for it. She's just like, if these other philosophers are right in saying that there's this connection between these concepts, my definition says things about what can be intelligent. Similarly, Badal argues this is one of the big questions that he thinks an account of life should help answer. But again, he doesn't use it to answer that question, right, with his account. Mayer's account of teleonomic properties also doesn't help because teleonomic properties are things that not just life forms possess on Mayer's account. It's not just living things that have teleonomic properties. Maybe you could argue that intelligence is a kind of teleonomic property, that consciousness is a kind of teleonomic property, or rationality is. But that's not enough to actually say that therefore things are living if they possess these teleonomic properties, because lots of things possess teleonomic properties on Mayer's account besides life forms. Clocks, again, that's the example I keep going back to because it's sort of the most obvious. A clock has teleonomic properties as Mayer describes it, but a clock he obviously thinks isn't a life form, right? It's just sort of obviously not, and then sort of through Badal you get, because it doesn't acquire the sort of program in the right way. Right, so yeah, teleonomic property just means sort of program directed. And so it can apply to things besides life forms. See, if you had there was a hand up, but now it's gone. Can the hand back or question answered or? All right. Well, if the question comes back, raise the hand up again. All right. So let's actually then turn and ask this question. We read last time the sort of Megarlis and Sagan piece, the sort of the sentient symphony thing, where they were sort of suggesting that it looks like all living things seem to have certain kinds of properties, and that we should have a more expansive definition of life just based on sort of the properties of choice and choosing. So their sort of goal in this article was to suggest that it was just a suggestion, that article's not being super rigorous, but to at least like entertain the possibility or ask the question, could it be the case that things like choice, things like intelligence, things like consciousness aren't absolutes, they're not all or nothing, They're rather things that exist in degrees, right? So they're present in one sort of minimal form in bacteria, and then more sophisticated forms sort of as you go up in complexity. Possibly even the things beyond the human, like superhuman structures. Right? Like the sort of internet space, right? The sort of this internet system that exists, right? That sort of uses all of us like our brain uses individual neurons, right? Like we're each like sort of individual neurons of the internet system, right? Maybe this is sort of a superhuman system that has some sort of super consciousness or super intelligence, maybe, or engages in super choices and choice or choosings. Right? So this is all pretty speculative, and I was indeed, I intended it in that way. I don't know how good a job I did teaching that article, because it's just not, it's a little too fluffy for me in some respects, so I'm not sure if my presentation of it was that great, but it's at least an interesting sort of thought experiment to entertain. Aristotle's going to come from a different direction. And sort of the opposite direction, actually. What he's interested in is more the question that a lot of you seem to me to be, like you were interested in too. What he's concerned with, if data is rational, doesn't he have to be alive? And not just data, right? Or the holographic doctor, or the replicants from Do Enter Dream of Electronic Sheep, right? Or whatever. If you've got a rational thing, do you therefore have to have a living thing? And Aristotle's answer is yes. And again, this is sort of the opposite question, right? Because the Margulis and Sagan, they're going sort of from the opposite. They're saying, could some low levels of intelligence even be found in single cellular organisms? Fine, but no one's going to confuse the activities of single cellular organisms as rational activities, right? They're not going to get confused with the kind of things that we do. Aristotle's more going in the opposite direction. If you find something that's capable of doing the sorts of things we humans are capable of doing, could that be occurring without the thing being alive? So let's start playing with his argument. Let me pause for a second, actually, before we even do that. So does anyone just have any sort of initial thoughts, questions about anything? All right. Then let's just go through his argument real fast. And that's what really, again, we're, like I said, this last little stuff we're doing, we're just playing with some fun ideas here. So we'll end with some Aristotle and play with some Aristotle. So here is Aristotle's argument. Everything, so not just living things, everything possesses various capacities for action. And so let's just give some examples of what he means by a capacity. Fire has the capacity to burn burnable things. What are some other examples we could give? Bows have the capacity to fire arrows when used by a skilled human. Humans have the capacity to talk. College professors, we have this capacity in the abstract. College professors have the capacity to talk in the concrete. And what's the distinction here? He's saying here something like a baby, right? A baby, in a sense, has the capacity to talk, but it can't actually do so until that capacity is sort of learned or actualized in some sense. Whereas me, a college professor, for me, the problem is getting me to shut up. Right? I have the capacity to talk, and I'm constantly doing so. I'm doing so all the time. Right? And other examples, he thinks doctors have a medical capacity. And indeed, and this one will be a little bit important later, but it might not be immediately obvious why. Doctors also have the capacity to kill people. Or a poisoning capacity. The capacity to kill those who are well. Or even just alive, actually. And this actually is a well-known point that Aristotle's making here, or not well-known in philosophy circles anyway. The Greek word for medicine is actually the exact same as the Greek word for poison. Right? And indeed, this is entirely right. Derrida, for example, has a field day playing with that fact. Caleb, go ahead.
So I think my question is like, to what degree are like rationality and morality like intertwined? You know, because I think that's
For
where I'm being caught up.
Aristotle? For Aristotle, do you mean?
Yeah, maybe Aristotle, but also just generally, because that's kind of where I'm struggling with like data. Data seems to be a moral person.
Right. So
Um,
usually,
yeah.
this is a somewhat contested point, but for most people at least, most people suggest that being a moral person requires some sort of rational capacity. That's sort of part and parcel of it, right? So, why is it okay to eat cows but not humans? It's because humans matter morally, cows don't matter morally.
Okay.
Why is it okay to and along the same token, right, why isn't the cow being evil when it like kills things? Because cows can't be good or evil or bad or anything. Cows just aren't moral agents. They're not moral subjects. The exception to this is sort of vaguely utilitarian like schools. They argue that moral personhood is predicated upon the ability to feel pleasure or pain. So those are the two sort of big theories that you sort of get. A thing is sort of a moral person. A thing matters morally. That's what I mean by moral person. A moral person is something that just matters morally. You have to take it into account morally. Probably the most prevalent is that a moral person is something that has some sort of rational capacity. You also see a moral person as something that has the capacity to feel pleasure or pain. Does that help at all?
Yeah, a little bit. And I don't mean to drag on the question. I'm just still a little confused.
That's
But
fine.
like, so I guess I don't know what we mean by rational. Like, is that
That's
interchangeable with intelligent?
Well, indeed, we're going to answer that question, at least for Aristotle, in just 1 second, maybe. So maybe let's hold that one. And because we're going to distinguish the rational capacities from the non-rational capacities in just a minute.
Okay, I'll mute myself and come back to it.
Yeah, so let's come back to it if the situation sort of presents itself. Yeah, as we sort of go along. Okay, so we've got these various capacities, right? And again, it's sort of weird to say that fire has a capacity to burn things, but actually, this is super important that we be able to say it. Actually, fire's not like choosing to burn things, certainly, right? But burning things is something that happens as a result of the fire. The fire is, in a sense, a cause of the burning. It can bring it about that burnable things start to burn. How are we doing just so far with this idea of capacities? Anyone got any questions or thoughts or comments or anything? Just on this point? All right. So these various capacities, Aristotle thinks, they occur within things in a variety of different ways. Right, some things just innately have certain capacities, and so the fire, for example, innately just has the capacity that it has. Some things have their capacities as a result of craft. Right, so like the bow and arrow, a craftsman needs to make them. Some things have their capacities as a result of habit. So, for example, the skilled archer. The skilled archer only has the capacity to fire a bow because they have practiced firing the bow. And then other things only have their capacities as a result of learning, he says. It's not actually clear to him whether or not talking would be a habit or something you learn, but at the very least, the doctoring skill, right, or the doctoring capacity, that's clearly the result of learning, right? That's not something you're born with. It's not even a habit you pick up just by practicing. At least I don't want to be your patient if it's just a habit you picked up by practicing. Medicine is something you learn by learning, right? by skill in some sense. All right, and so as a result, this talk of capacity doesn't really help us with life. Just as we said it so far, at least doesn't help us one way or the other, right? Innate. So some things have innate capacities are non-living, but some are living, right? Humans in the sense of this baby, right? The baby has the innate potential, at least, the capacity to talk in the abstract, at least, right? And again, the baby also has the potential, this is, sorry to be grim, the baby has the potential, the capacity to fall down, right? Because it's a natural object, and two, in addition to being a baby, and so it can fall, right? So none of this per se helps. The thing that Aristotle thinks is interesting here, the thing that potentially helps, is we can distinguish another way of, so this is how we acquire the capacities. There are basically two different classes of capacities, he thinks. There are some capacities that are realized or that are actualized whenever the situation is right. So, for example, whenever fire encounters a burnable thing, fire burns the thing. Right? It happens every single time, without fail, without exception. Right? This is actually a big deal, by the way, just as a little aside. This is actually a super big deal in medieval philosophy, it turns out, because it seems like saying this, Aristotle saying this, eliminates the possibility of miracles. It seems like by saying this, Aristotle has said God could never make it such that, for example, Muhammad couldn't walk through fire without being burned. And so it leads some thinkers like the theologian Al-Ghazali to argue that actually, no, nothing has capacities but God. God causes fire to burn burnable things, whenever he wants to, but he can choose not to. Right. So this is actually, this sort of point here is actually a really important one in medieval thought when people sort of start taking up Aristotle and playing with him and using him in interesting ways. This is also true about certain things about human beings, right? Whenever a human body falls, it falls until it hits the ground. Its capacity of falling, right? Whenever the situation is right, my capacity to fall just carries itself out whether I want to or not. And this is most capacities, he thinks. This is most capacities he thinks has this characteristic. There's an example we were talking about last class. So we were talking about what's going on when a plant sort of turns its leaves to face the sun. That would be an example of this first kind. Whenever a plant's leaves are not facing the sun, they turn to face the sun. The plant has a capacity, right? And again, a far more interesting capacity maybe even than the fire we were talking about last time, right? Like the plant can sort of turn its leaves in all kinds of directions, whereas fire just kind of like does the same boring thing over and over again. So plants are more interesting than fire is. But even still, whenever the plant is sort of not, the leaf is not facing the sun, it will turn to face the sun, right? So this is still a capacity of this first sort, sort of living capacity of the first sort. How are we doing? I take it this point's probably more or less obvious. Anyone have any questions just on this one? All right. And indeed, the same thing is also true of the bow and arrow. Whenever a bow is utilized by a skilled archer, again, because there are all kinds of conditions, right? But whenever a bow is utilized by a skilled archer, it will fire an arrow. It always happens automatically. The bow is like, it's never like, I'm not feeling it today. Sorry, archer. All right. So this is the overwhelming majority of capacities. There are some capacities, however, that this is not true for, Aristotle thinks. And not only that, not only do they sometimes not realize their capacity, sometimes they realize the exact opposite capacity. Sometimes doctors cure, but sometimes they kill. Very different than in the other cases, right? So let's just do some examples here, right? So he said whenever the bow is utilized by a skilled archer, the bow is going to fire. But whenever a skilled archer has a bow, they're not always going to fire the bow. Sometimes they fire it, sometimes they don't. All right, we got a chat question here. Are these like teleonomic properties? Some of them, yeah, I mean, so some of them are indeed going to be teleonomic, but for Aristotle, that's not necessarily the key, right? Because we wouldn't want to say like the fire burning isn't really, that's not teleonomic, right? There's no program governing the activity of the fire. The same thing with the human body falling, that's not teleonomic. But the bow, that's teleonomic, right? It has some sort of program built into its sort of technical construction. And even more so than that, we can say the plant leaf, that's a teleonomic property. So certainly some of the things we're talking about here are teleonomic properties, but that's actually not the aspect of these properties that he's focusing on. He's not actually focusing on their teleonomic structure. He's focusing on, do they always happen? If you think about it, do they always fire, or do they sometimes fire? Do they sometimes not? Sometimes doctors just are, I'm busy, I don't feel like hearing you today. Right? That is a possibility that can happen. That is not something the plant will ever do. The plant will never orient itself. This second kind, these are rational capacities, Aristotle says. These are capacities that only rational things possess. Right? And it's, in a sense, capacities that you can have but not have to realize. How are we doing so far? Is this making reasonable sense to people? Do people have questions? Do people have thoughts? This second category, it's basically like, I wonder what to be. So like, if I think of a good example here. All right. So I got a knife and I got a sheet of paper. The knife is always going to cut. Right? Every time I use it, the knife is always going to do its thing. The knife is never going to be like, you know what, Paul, I'm not feeling it today. I don't care that you want me to cut. I'm not going to cut. I cannot, though. So same situation, sheet of paper, knife. I can decide not to realize my capacity to use this knife. That makes me fundamentally different from the knife. It makes me, in terms of that capacity, fundamentally different from the plant. And does this have to do with choice? Amongst other things, it might be more than just choice, but yes, at the very least, one example of why I'm rational is that I have choice, and the knife does not. How are we doing so far? Is this okay? Is this clear-ish? Clear enough? Again, I can't see your faces, so when there's silence, it's like when there's silence, I don't know what the silence means. All right, well, I'll keep going on at least, but don't hesitate to jump in still. All right. So we're saying that, or Aristotle is now saying that these capacities that can either fire or not fire, they're the rational ones. Okay? And if we trace this out, I think everything's going to work pretty nicely, right? Even computer code. So let's do a hard example for Aristotle. What about computer code? Is that a rational capacity as Aristotle's defining it? And by computer code, to be really clear, I just mean sort of normal. I don't mean anything fancy. I just mean like the normal stuff my computer now does. I don't mean something like the holographic doctor, right? Something more sophisticated. I just mean my normal sort of computer doing its normal computer things. Does my computer have rational capacity? I think the answer is pretty clearly no. It doesn't. Because my computer, whenever the right conditions are present for it to execute some piece of code, it will indeed execute the piece of code. Right? It's an automatic process still. And so modern computers, while again, computers have telenomic properties, our current computer systems do not have rational capacities in Aristotle's sense. Okay? They are not capable of either doing or not doing what they're programmed to do. They just always do what they're programmed to do. Now, what they're programmed to do isn't always sort of called upon to happen, right? My computer's not always being called upon to display video. But whenever it is called upon to display video, it will display that video in accordance with its code in a sort of a necessary sense. Right? There's my computer's just not going to be like, sorry, I don't feel like executing code today. It might run into an error, but that's not the same thing. Right? An error is a failure to execute the code. It's not going to ever just not execute code that it could execute. And so therefore it does not possess a rational capacity. And indeed, most let's actually leave animals out, because animals actually, some animals do have capacities, but plant behavior similarly, plants don't ever seem as if they're going to have rational capacities either by this definition. All right, so how are we doing? How are people doing with this? Any questions, any thoughts so far? All right. So let's move on to the next phase of the argument. This is phase 1, basically. So phase 2. Okay, so why do rational capacities sometimes fire and sometimes not?
That's the desire part, right?
Yep, exactly. For him, it has to be, the answer has to be desire in some sense. Or choice. That's where the choice comes in as well, possibly, like what he calls the deliberative discrimination. Right? And indeed, this actually is going to apply in a weird sense to even animal life. I mean, animals might not have rational capacities, but they have something at least very similar to rational capacities. Even animals won't pursue food if it's available to them if they're not feeling hungry, right? Now, that's not to say that their pursuit of food is necessarily a rational capacity, because whenever they are hungry, they will pursue it. That's basically why they still don't have a rational capacity. But even animals look closer to having rational capacities than other things because of this sort of presence of desire in some sense or another, desire or choice, right? So why does the doctor sometimes cure and sometimes not? Because sometimes the doctor desires the cure. Or sometimes the doctor decides that it's for the best to cure. So chooses in Aristotle's sense of the word. That's what Aristotle means by a choice, deciding that something is best. And sometimes the doctor doesn't desire or decide. And indeed, sometimes the doctor desires to use their capacity to cure, to kill. That can happen too. So someone's asking in the chat, and it's a good question, does this mean that Aristotle is saying that things with rational capacities have free will? Not necessarily. This doesn't necessarily entail that we have any sort of free will. It sort of depends on what you mean by free will a little bit. If you mean by free will, the doctor has could have made the opposite choice in a given moment, that doesn't necessarily follow. So that's what's called libertarian freedom. The doctor couldn't. Aristotle thinks that it's the case that you always do whatever seems best to you. That's in the case of human beings. We always do what we just think is best. So if something seems best to you, you are going to do it. Right? You don't have the ability to not do what you think is best in Aristotelian thought. And in general, that's actually true in ancient thought in general. So if by free will you mean libertarian freedom, no. It does mean, though, that rational agents are always self-directed in their behavior. But we do sort of have some sort of ability to have self-guided behavior. It's guided by what seems best to me or what I desire. And so if that's what you mean by free will, then yes, we have free will. But that would usually be characterized as a kind of, the second one would be usually characterized just as like a sort of compatibilist position, not as strictly speaking libertarian freedom. But I hope that's helpful for the chat question. Yeah, for him all that he needs for this is just that this is different. That acting on the basis of desire is different from things that don't act on the basis of desire. That's all he sort of needs. Whether or not that difference has anything to do with freedom, that's sort of a separate question for him. All right, similarly, let's do the other example, right? Sometimes the archer will fire, sometimes they won't, based on what they desire. So that their capacity will indeed sometimes realize itself, sometimes will not. The cool thing about the reason why I like this way of characterizing irrational desire is it's actually pretty objectively measurable in a certain sense. Like, it's actually, I mean, it's maybe not like measurable in a certain sense, but like it's pretty empirically obvious whether or not something is doing this. Like, do you ever see something, sometimes do something, and sometimes not do it? if you ever see that, you're sort of seeing an example of what Aristotle's talking about, right? You never see fire just not feel like it that day. Whereas indeed, you pretty apparently see humans not feeling like it. And again, we don't see computer code not feeling like it some days. Okay. So this is indeed something that you can sort of empirically observe, at least. Maybe measure is a weird word, but at least you can empirically observe this in just studying things. You can look at data and see, does data always realize that capacity whenever he has the opportunity to do it? And the answer is just obviously no. Like, at least, and also data has the capacity to punch things that threaten the crew, and he doesn't always punch them, right? Whereas fire always burns, right? Computer code always executes if the conditions are called for executing. Data sometimes has a situation where he can punch something and he doesn't punch it. And indeed, that's why it's just sort of like everyone, when they watch Star Trek, just sort of thinks this is sort of obvious. That it's a different kind of capacity. And again, this doesn't imply that data is not completely programmed, that its behavior is not deterministic in some sense. It just implies that some of the things data can do, data decides when data will do them and when data won't do them. Right? Maybe on the basis of entirely deterministic pressures, but not on the basis of any sort of limitation within the capacity itself. Whereas even my computer just acts whenever it can act, and it doesn't act whenever its code doesn't let it act. That just doesn't seem to be an accurate description of the kind of behaviors we see present, and the kind of capacities we see being realized by data. Again, how are we doing? Is this okay? All right. So let's finish up the argument. Actually, there's a question. Go ahead. You are unmuted. Or no questions. Okay, no questions. Never mind then. right. Next step, step 3. But to have desire, you also have to have perception. Why is this? Desire and choice. Again, these are different concepts in Aristotle, but I'm just going to treat them as similar because he treats them as similar. Desire or choice, both of those require distinguishing between states. Right? And to distinguish between states, you have to be able to perceive those states. So nothing perceives that doesn't also desire. And it's actually a key part of Aristotle's account of life forms for him in other places, that only perceivers desire things and only desirers perceive things. That they sort of are mutually entailed capacities. If you have one capacity, you have to have the other capacity. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. And not only that, you also have to have nutritive capacities. Because so why this? Desire and perception are always oriented toward acquiring some good for yourself. And to acquire a good for yourself, something has to be good for you. Which entails that in some sense you want to preserve your being. And only things with nutrition are capable of, with this nutrition capacity, are capable of preserving their own being. But that's how he basically defines. We were calling metabolism. He just calls this the nutritive capacity. Right? And the nutritive capacity is capacity for self-preservation, for a system to preserve itself. You need that for something to be good. That's what's good for you, is to preserve yourself. And so at a bare minimum, right? The bare minimum that's needed to say that something is good for you is that preserving yourself is good for you. So the system then works to preserve itself. Caleb, go ahead.
Yeah, so just thinking about like the in Andrew's Dream of Electric Sheep, right? Like they fled and lied and even tried to like fight and kill Decker. So would that be like a nutritive capacity because they're trying to preserve their own being, or is it something like a little more tangible like metabolism?
It is. I think that is the difference here, actually. I think for why he's not talking about this in metabolic terms, because I think, yes, I think if what you just said is right, if what they are genuinely doing is trying to preserve themselves, and it seems like they are, there's no reason to say that you're wrong to characterize it that way. If that's genuinely right, then they are indeed engaged in a nutritive activity.
Okay.
They're doing it differently than a plant. So sort of the hierarchy here, there's sort of an implicit hierarchy here. So rational beings have rational capacities. Animals have perception and desire. And plants, what Aristotle calls plants, have capacities for nutrition.
I think that's kind of where I'm being caught up at as well, is like if we look at data and we look at bacteria, there's obviously something that makes data more human or seem like distinguishable than bacteria. And I don't know if that's like a moral reasoning or if it's rationality, and like how rationality and morality can be tied to living or not, but I don't know.
Maybe put the moral question aside for 1 second at least, because the moral question might be confusing the issue a little bit.
Yeah. Okay.
What more matters? So for Aristotle, rational capacities are what differentiate animals from plants, but rational animals also have perception and desire. And they nutriate, they have the nutritional capacity, right? But they have these capacities in a very different way. Right? Because of the presence of the rational capacity. So let's do an even before we get talking about rational animals, let's just talk about animals. How are animals related to plants? Animals do all the same things in one sense that plants do. Right? They acquire nutrition in order to sort of maintain their being. Right? But because animals perceive the world around them, they acquire nutrition. The way they acquire nutrition is nothing like the way that plants acquire nutrition. It's not the same at all. It's been radically transformed as a result of the kind of rational capacities that the thing possesses. The same thing is true for us. We do everything animals do. But we do all these things in completely different ways. Right? I don't eat in anything resembling the way that my dog eats. Almost just one on just a purely mechanical level, but also on all kinds of other more sophisticated and weird levels, right? Like my dog never goes to a dinner party. Whereas when I do, at least if there's not global pandemics happening, I sometimes do go to a dinner party, right? Indeed, we have eating customs, we have eating habits. Again, none of that even makes sense to say for a dog. The way we eat, the way we do nutrition, the way we desire, the way we perceive the world is completely changed compared to how animals do those same activities. Aristotle thinks because of the presence of these rational capacities within ourselves. And what if preserving your life means altering it in some sense? That's a great question. So like you can only preserve your life by putting it into a robot body. As Aristotle is describing it, that is intrinsically would be a nutritive activity. It would be like a weird one that has become radically transformed as a result of our rationality. But basically, nutrition is the capacity to preserve your own life. He's very straightforward about this. That's what he means by nutrition. It's just the capacity to preserve your own being. And so the deer, when it flees from the predator, that is in a sense a nutritive activity, that it's preserving itself. But it's one that's been mediated by perception, desire, and then locomotion, right? So yeah, if you indeed decided to put your brain in a robot body to preserve your life, then that is an example of your rational capacity altering your nutritive capacity, right? You nutritively preserving your own being in a novel way. Now, Aristotle didn't consider this possibility, right? That's not putting your brain in a robot body wasn't the things Aristotle thought of. But I think based on what he's laying out here, that indeed would still be a nutritive activity, one just radically transformed by the activity of rationality, right? And so in terms of some of the things you were drawing, we could say Aristotle's notion of nutrition here, this is a purely formal notion. As he is defining it, this is a formalist notion. It's not one in which the sort of material conditions of nutrition matter. The specific material processes do not matter. Anything that is working to preserve its own being is nutriating, to use a weird verb, but I think that is the verb, nutriate. Go ahead.
So when, like, would Aristotle say that we are capable of, like, sort of like acting in a way that's good for our self-interest on an individual scale and like not on species scale? So like, I guess like the things I'm thinking about is evolutionary psychology, because a lot of the claims in evolutionary psychology is that we act for the sake that would be the best for preserving like the species. And also
Right.
when I back to the four causes, one of the causes, like I remember he was saying that we will act in certain purposes that is similar to everyone else who is the same species, right?
Yes, I think so. First of all, my computer's acting really weird. Can you all still see and hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I might not be able to go back to the whiteboard because I think Zoom has crashed, but not crashed.
Okay.
It's sort of in a weird sort of like half state between being crashed and not. But if you can still hear me, that's fine.
It took
So
me
yes,
6 tries to get on here. I think it's just a Zoom in general.
yeah, it could just be a tech. But so long as it's still working, I'll go as long as it's still working. Okay, so yes, I think you're exactly right. Aristotle's account that he's giving is not sort of predicated upon the species level description.
It's not.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Now, it might turn out to be the case that even still animals, because animals don't actually have these specifically rational capacities, that they are still always, in fact, acting on the basis of the evolutionary best interest of their species, even if they don't know it, something like that. But we human beings, because we have the rational capacity to act in such a way that it's towards the evolutionary advantage of our species, but we also have the capacity to not act in that way too. Our rational capacity is sort of this capacity to do either.
Yeah.
In a sense.
Yeah, so then also like how would it connect to like one of his causes that we covered like in the beginning of the class, the last cause that like all like species have purpose according to
right. So for him, the way this is going to specifically work, at least it worked in this specific context anyway, so it might work very differently if he was talking in an ethical context, but in this specific context at least, this is the sense that you always do what seems best to you as a rational being.
Okay.
So you're always doing this seeming best, whatever seems like the best thing to do, that is sort of the final cause of your action, in a sense. Right? So if it seems best to me that I eat this cake, then I'm going to go eat the cake. Right? The cake is my final cause, but it's not the cake just in general. The cake, qua seeming best to me, is the cause of my behavior.
Right. So it can be best like short term, long term. It doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And now if I'm being smart, right, I won't eat the whole cake because that would not be to my long term good. But I might not recognize that in the moment and still act on the basis of what seems best to me and just might then do something stupid. But the capacity to be stupid is indeed a capacity, something that's opened up. Rationality makes it so that we can be intelligent, but if it's a rational capacity, it also is the capacity to do the opposite, to make us stupid.
Right.
To do something dumb.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
All right, excellent, good. Let's see. I'm actually sort of amazed that this is still working because I can't unmute anyone. I can't go back to the whiteboard. I am just getting a Zoom has crashed error message, but somehow you're all still hearing me. So that's cool. So I guess I'm just going to talk my way through it. Unfortunately, I can't unmute anyone. And I don't think I'll be able to access the chat either. So let's start wrapping up since I don't think I'll be able to continue this much longer. Okay, anything that has a nutritive capacity is alive, Aristotle thinks. That's sort of the last premise here. If you have a nutritive capacity, you are alive. So if you wanted to come up with what is in the most baseline level Aristotle's definition of life, Aristotle thinks anything that actively is attempting to preserve itself is alive and would count as a life form. And indeed, now we could ask all kinds of ambiguous questions. He says fire is the most lifelike of the elements, even though he doesn't really think it's trying to preserve itself in the right sense. So there'd be a lot of like interesting, complicated questions we can ask. This doesn't necessarily solve all of our problems or make everything easy for everyone if that we're using this sort of framework. But that's his sort of baseline. Anything that you can properly speaking characterize as working to preserve itself is indeed alive in a minimal sense. And so if we ever discovered something, say, let's do the Bowden example, if we ever found a cloud that seemed to be engaging in rational activities, okay? Sometimes it did certain things, other times we didn't, and it didn't, as best as we could tell, it was doing that on the basis of some kind of desire or choice. You know you have to have a life form because you have something that's working to preserve itself. It's basically rational capacities require animal capacities, require nutritive capacities, so therefore life. How's that going? Is that I think you can all unmute yourself. I guess I can't see anything chat-wise, but if anyone wants to like ask things, just unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hey, I got two questions, so that's okay.
Go ahead, sure.
The first one is in regards to like the nutriating capacity, I guess.
Mhm.
As how would suicide fit into that? Like, how would desiring, like, seeing that ending your existence would be best for your own
Right.
existence?
Yeah, so that fits in the sense that just rational capacities really change things, right? So you would be deciding that what's best for, it'd be super weird. You'd be deciding what is best for you is to die. Because that's actually what you're saying when you decide, that's what Kant's objection to suicide is, that Kant's objection to suicide is that it's a logical contradiction. You're deciding that what's best for you is to not be you anymore. You to be nothing is somehow for the best for you. But that actually still fits the structure, right? You're still working for what's best for you. It's just you've come to some sort of really bizarre conclusion about what's best for you. But we can come up with even other sort of similar examples, right? If you chose to sacrifice your life for your city, right? You've decided there that what's best for you isn't that you continue to live, but that your city continue to live. That's somehow best for you. It still ties back ultimately into this sort of nutritive capacity, this orientation toward what's good for yourself.
All right, thanks. And my second question, I guess, is like totally different.
Okay.
But if it would be possible.
Before you get to the second question, this actually maybe relates to something that Angelino was asking too. It's this talk of that we're saying of what seems best to you. It's always self-oriented, but it's not necessarily selfish. Right? It would be if you're not a rational animal. Animals are always selfish. But because of reason, you can actually identify your self-good with things beyond yourself.
Okay.
And so that's a difference. That would indeed be another difference of the present and rational capacity. Sorry, go to your second question.
Okay. Yeah. Would it, in regards to like data and like the hologram and the silicon-based life form,
Okay.
would it be possible to prove rationality first and then work back from that and conclude that it's alive? If we decided like, oh, it has qualities that look rational, that means like by necessity that it must be alive.
It's not clear if that would be easier. maybe I'll just put it like that. It's not clear if that would be easier or harder, but if you could do it, it would work. I'd put it like that. I'd sort of put it in that form. If you could establish that they are genuinely rational, then by Aristotle's argument, you have established that they are genuinely alive.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? The really cool thing about the way that Aristotle is conceptualizing all of this is the way in which he's making all life forms continuous, but also explaining the enormous variety of different kinds of life that we see. Okay? We still get humans to be special, but they're still also just animals. They're just animals with a new capacity, right? And as a result of that capacity, they do all the other animal stuff really differently. Okay? And they can do it in novel sort of forms. And the marker of this is the presence of a rational capacity. And again, it can actually be hard to tell if what you're looking at is a rational capacity or not. But if you could tell this thing is demonstrating rational capacities, then you would know it was alive. And so it's sort of Aristotle coming at the same question we've been talking about, but almost in the reverse. And the way a lot of your questions to me have sort of been actually articulated is like, I don't know if Data's alive or not, but I know he's rational. So if you're right in knowing that he's genuinely a rational being, then by Aristotle's standards, you must know he's also a living thing. So this sort of Aristotle is almost working in the opposite way that we've been working on everything else this semester. And it's also maybe a way that we could sort of answer the Bowden worry, right? Her claim was that like nothing could ever make us want to give up the sort of materialistic definition of metabolism. She can't imagine what would ever inspire it. Maybe if she said was like, maybe if we found some weird sentient cloud that could inspire us. But she's like, I don't see how we could ever discover such a thing. Well, again, this is giving us a way that maybe potentially such a thing could be discovered. If we could discover that the sentient cloud is engaging in rational capacities and has rational capacities, then we would have indeed motive to give up the sort of material definition of metabolism and do the formal definition that Aristotle is proposing. So how's everyone doing? How's this? This was last little fun. Hopefully, if nothing else, this is a fun little thought experiment. Going back to the ancient world one last time. Began the semester with Aristotle. Now we can end with the semester with Aristotle.
I have one more question.
Go ahead. Absolutely.
Yeah. So like, I just don't see how Aristotle's account proves something's living based off rationality. You know.
So here's the rough logic. Okay, so maybe give like rough big picture summary. So if you have a rational capacity, then you have to have perceptive capacities and desiring capacities. If you have perceptive and desiring capacities, you have to have nutritive capacities. If you have nutritive capacities, you're alive.
All right. It seems a little reductive of some of like the physiochemical things, or like accounts.
So say a little bit more. Say a little bit more there.
Like, to me, it just seems like it's and maybe it's because it's product of the time, but like he doesn't really offer much. He's just saying things can see or understand things, and they try to perpetuate themselves, therefore they're alive.
So the key thing is really the last point. So things preserve themselves. So things are working in some sense to preserve themselves, or working for their own good, so therefore they're alive. Right. So that's the last part. That's right. And that's, I mean, he's just saying like that's what life is. Like life is anything that does that.
Okay. I think I just have to think on it more, honestly.
Because it's actually interesting. Like, let's compare this with the Schrodinger, because it's not the same as the Schrodinger. You're right, because the Schrodinger is sort of this like materialist kind of account, as is Bowden. But it's not radically dissimilar either in other respects, right? Because what he's saying is like, what Schrodinger is basically saying is that like, yes, and in order for something to preserve itself, it must be a metabolizing system of a certain sort. Right? That's sort of like the requirement for something to sort of satisfy the formal condition of self-preservation. That's basically what the entropy stuff, it is reductive, I agree, but if you boil it down, the entropy stuff kind of amounts to this thing preserves itself in some sense. It maintains its entropic level, it preserves itself. If Schrodinger's right, and the only way that something can preserve itself is on the basis of this particular chemical metabolic process, or Bowden is right, about that only on the basis of these particular metabolic processes are things able to preserve themselves, then we're just never going to find a sentient cloud or a sentient android, right? Or a sentient digital thing. We'll just never find one. Will turn out to be a rational program, because the program can't be rational. It's not going to be working to preserve itself, because it's not going to metabolize in the right sense. So there's still the possibility of them being proven right? I mean, the fact that like we can imagine data's an actor in a suit, right? Like that doesn't mean data is actually possible. right? Or that anything like Data could ever actually exist, or it doesn't mean that anything like the holographic doctor could ever actually exist. Right? Maybe they're impossible. Maybe they're sort of impossible thought experiments, which is what Bowden thinks, actually. She says that very explicitly, that we can imagine all kinds of things being alive that doesn't give us any reason to call them life, right? We can imagine all kinds of things with any sort of properties you want. But her claim is we're never going to actually discover something that has rational capacities that doesn't metabolize in the strong material sense of the term. And if she's right, and she could still be right, we're just never going to find a Data or a holographic doctor or a replicant. We're just never going to find something with those rational capacities. Those will have turned out to be impossible thought experiments that, you know, speculative humans had engaged within. So does that help? Does that help maybe?
Yeah, it actually just like kind of gave me my answer completely. Like,
Okay.
Data seems like he's alive, but there's no such thing as Data in the real world. So
That's right. So
that kind of,
yeah.
that the perception of Data seeming alive to some extent is ultimately redundant because it doesn't exist.
Right. So, yeah, the best you could say is that if something like Data did exist, then on Aristotle's account, it would have to be counted as alive.
That's sobering. All right, cool.
Okay. But if it can't, then it doesn't matter, right? Like, if something like Data can't actually really exist, then it's not really possible anyway. So impossible things can be anything you want, I guess, right? Impossible things can be square circles for all we care, right? I mean, he would neither be alive nor not alive if he's not really possible. So this doesn't establish that Data is alive. It just establishes that if things like Data did occur, they would be alive. Or things like the holographic doctor. Again, if the holographic doctor has rational capacities, if a piece of computer code demonstrated rational capacity, then that piece of computer code would indeed be alive. Any others? All right. Well, if everyone else is good, I'm sorry that Zoom has crashed during the last 10 minutes of class. I still can't believe this is actually working, given how I can't see any of you. Like, Zoom is completely not working for me, so I hope I'm not just like talking to myself and somehow like hallucinating your answers or whatever. I also hope the recording is still working. But so we'll end it here for today. Then what we'll do on Tuesday, we're just going to do some big course overview stuff. Bring in paper questions, bring in anything you got. And then that'll be our last sort of formal final meeting for the semester. Yeah, so thank you all very much. Have a great weekend. And I will talk to you later and hope this recording is actually working. Have a good weekend.